In the final days before Japan surrendered, smoke rose from the compound at Pingfang, outside Harbin. Buildings were being destroyed from within. Prisoners who could have testified were killed. Records were hidden, burned, or carried away. The men in charge understood what defeat would mean if the world saw the rooms, cages, operating tables, and bodies. At the center of this retreat was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a military doctor who had spent years building one of the most secret weapons programs of the Japanese Empire. His unit had not simply studied disease. It had turned disease into an instrument of war, and it had used living human beings as material. In August 1945, Ishii did not know who would reach him first. The Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan. American forces were preparing to occupy the home islands. China had suffered years of occupation and atrocity. Any one of them could have demanded answers. Any one of them could have placed Unit 731 before an international court. But Ishii also knew something else. He possessed information that no ethical laboratory could ever produce. His bargaining power was buried in tissue samples, autopsy notes, plague cultures, frostbite charts, and reports on human beings infected, frozen, cut open, and killed in the name of military science. The question after the war was not whether crimes had happened. The question was who would decide what those crimes were worth. Unit 731 grew from Japan's Imperial War in Asia and from Ishii's belief that modern armies needed biological weapons. In the 1930s, Japan controlled Manchuria through the puppet state of Manchukuo. There, far from Tokyo and shielded by military secrecy, Ishii's organization expanded under the Army Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Department. Its public language suggested sanitation and disease control. Its real purpose was offensive biological warfare. The main base at Pingfang was enormous. It had laboratories, barracks, animal facilities, production areas, and a prison hidden inside the compound. Historians estimate that thousands died there, with victims mainly Chinese civilians and resistance prisoners, but also Koreans, Russians, Mongolians, and others caught in the machinery of occupation. Many victims did not enter the records under their real names. They vanished through military police channels, prison transfers, and occupation sweeps, leaving families with no trial, no grave, and no proof of what had happened. Inside the unit, prisoners were dehumanized with a code word that compared them to logs. The word made killing sound like processing. Pingfang was the most infamous site, but it was not the only one. Unit 731 belonged to a wider network of Japanese biological warfare units spread across occupied Asia, including units linked to Beijing, Nanjing, Guangzhou, and Singapore. Military medicine, empire, and secrecy worked together. The experiments were designed around military questions. How fast did plague spread through a living body? How long could anthrax survive in delivery systems? What happened when frostbite was frozen, thawed, treated, and frozen again? What dose killed? What dose disabled? What could be used against troops, cities, wells, fields, and animals? To answer those questions, Unit 731 crossed every boundary that medicine claimed to defend. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, typhus, anthrax, and other diseases. Some were tied to stakes at testing grounds, while bombs dispersed bacteria or infected fleas. Others were placed in pressure chambers, exposed to poison shot, with contaminated weapons or left in extreme cold. In frostbite studies, limbs were frozen until they hardened. Doctors then tested methods of thawing and recorded the damage. The most infamous experiments were vivisections. Victims were cut open while still alive, often without anesthesia, because doctors wanted to observe disease progression in organs before death changed the tissue. This was not medicine losing control. It was a system built to convert suffering into military data. Japan also used biological weapons beyond the laboratory. During the war in China, Japanese forces contaminated areas with pathogens and plague-infected fleas. The exact death toll remains debated because disease, war, famine, and displacement overlapped. In villages already damaged by invasion, hunger, forced movement, and collapsing health systems, an outbreak could be both a biological attack and a wartime disaster, making responsibility difficult to prove afterward. But historians agree that Unit 731 moved biological warfare from experiment into field use in China. By 1945, the empire that had protected the unit was collapsing. Ishii ordered the destruction of the Pingfang site. Remaining prisoners were killed. Staff were told to keep silent. Physical evidence was damaged, but the people who made the program survived. The Allied occupation of Japan began under General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied powers. The occupation promised reform, demilitarization, and war crimes accountability. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East opened in Tokyo in 1946, yet Unit 731 barely appeared in that courtroom. There was a passing reference to Japanese experiments with poisonous serums on Chinese civilians, but the issue was not developed into a full case, because Unit 731 was not fully exposed at Tokyo. The post-war record itself became distorted. What was missing from the courtroom became easier to deny in public memory. Prosecutors did not yet have the evidence, witnesses, or political support to expose the biological warfare program. In September 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, a microbiologist connected to the American biological warfare establishment, arrived in Japan to investigate Japanese research. If they held back too long, the Soviets might gain access. If they gave the Americans enough, they might survive. The emerging Cold War changed the meaning of the evidence. To China and the Soviet Union, Unit 731 was a war crimes case. To American military intelligence, it was also a possible scientific prize. Fort Detrick in Maryland was the center of the United States biological warfare program. Its officers wanted to know what Japan had learned from human experimentation, because American and British scientists could not legally or ethically reproduce those trials. American teams questioned Ishii and other personnel. The Japanese scientists insisted on protection. They wanted assurance that what they revealed would not be used against them in court. On May 6, 1947, MacArthur sent a top-secret message to Washington. Its central meaning was clear. More information could be obtained if the Japanese were told their information would remain in intelligence channels and would not be used as war crimes evidence. It converted them into classified assets. Later that year, American officials described the Japanese data as too important to lose, especially with the Soviet Union now viewed as the main strategic rival. Reports from American specialists argued that the material had value because it came from human experiments that could not be conducted in the United States. The data was valuable because of the acts that made it criminal. Victims were denied a public accounting because information taken from their bodies was treated as more useful than testimony about their deaths. The United States did not simply ignore Unit 731. It collected from it. Researchers linked to Fort Detrick reviewed Japanese reports on plague, anthrax, bacterial delivery, infection routes, and the effects of disease on human tissue. Some material was judged uneven, and historians still debate how much it improved American weapons research. But in 1947, policymakers acted as if the information mattered enough to shield the men who produced it. The decision also served another purpose. Washington wanted exclusive access. If Unit 731 became a public trial, the Soviet Union could demand evidence, examine witnesses, and learn what the Japanese had learned. Secrecy kept the material in American channels. The contrast with Germany was striking. At Nuremberg, Nazi doctors were tried for human experimentation, and the Nuremberg Code set standards for consent. In Japan, many men responsible for comparable crimes escaped prosecution under the American occupation. The Soviet Union held its own trial in Khabarovsk in December 1949, where former Japanese personnel testified about biological warfare. But the West dismissed the proceedings as communist propaganda, because the Tokyo Tribunal had not exposed Unit 731. The Soviet record could be brushed aside. Some of it was shaped by Soviet aims, but the core subject was real. The bargain weakened command responsibility. Unit 731 was not a band of rogue doctors acting outside the state. It was protected by the Imperial Japanese Army, supplied by military channels, and linked to a wider network of biological warfare units in occupied China. The unit depended on the Kempeitai, Japan's military police, which helped deliver prisoners into the system. This connected the experiments to the wider machinery of occupation, surveillance, and terror. The language of prevention and water supply gave the project a respectable cover. while army police and occupation structures delivered prisoners into its hands. The crime was institutional. It depended on budgets, transport, uniforms, ranks, buildings, and orders. A public trial could have shown that chain. It could have placed Ishii's work beside the larger machinery of empire, occupation, and racial contempt that made victims available. It could have forced victims to explain how trained physicians persuaded themselves that murder was research. Instead, the chain was broken into private interviews. Each man could become an informant rather than a defendant. Each report could be treated as an intelligence file rather than evidence of a system. The data from Unit 731 was often described by American specialists as rare because it came from humans. Yet rarity is not the same as reliability. Experiments built on coercion, terror, pool controls, and military objectives do not automatically become sound science because they are forbidden. Some scholars have questioned how useful the material truly was. The United States protected war criminals for information it believed might give an advantage. But the real scientific value may have been narrower than the moral cost. The decision cannot be dismissed as confusion. Officials knew enough. They knew human experiments had occurred. They knew prosecution would become harder if promises were made. They knew the Soviets wanted access. They chose secrecy because secrecy served policy. This is why Unit 731 remains more than a record of wartime cruelty. It is a case study in how institutions behave when evidence of atrocity also appears useful. The danger begins when the victim disappears from the calculation, and only the file remains. Without a public trial, victims remain unnamed. Families in China and elsewhere were left with fragments, a disappearance, a rumor, a village outbreak. A body never returned. The prison inside Pingfang had no known survivors who could walk into court and describe the full system from beginning to the end. The men who could explain it had been protected. The scientists' names survived in files, careers, and intelligence records. The victims' names often did not. That imbalance is one of the deepest consequences of the cover-up. Many former Unit 731 members resumed civilian lives. Some entered universities, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, or public health institutions in post-war Japan. Their careers did not all follow the same path, and not every person attached to the wartime network held that same level of responsibility. But the absence of prosecution allowed senior figures and specialists to re-enter respectable society without a public reckoning equal to the scale of the crimes. Ishii lived in Japan after the war and died in 1959. He never faced the Tokyo Tribunal. His name became known gradually through scattered testimony, journalism, declassified documents, Chinese investigations, and historians' work. For decades, Unit 731 existed in an uneasy space between memory and denial. Survivors of affected communities remembered. Former staff sometimes spoke late in life. Governments released pieces of evidence. But the full story reached the public slowly, long after the men who made the decisions had escaped judgment. The erasure was not total. It was worse in another way. The truth existed, but it was managed. It appeared in classified cables, intelligence summaries, interviews, and archives, while public justice moved around it. This allowed officials to say little, courts to hear little, and societies to absorb little. The moral defense offered at the time was national security. American officers feared a future biological war. They feared Soviet research. They feared falling behind. In that atmosphere, Unit 731's records looked like a weapon already paid for by someone else's debt. The cost to the people making the decision had already been spent. But costs do not disappear because governments classify them. They are transferred. They pass to victims whose suffering is not acknowledged. They pass to families without answers. They pass to historians forced to reconstruct crimes from damaged evidence. They pass to medical ethics where the question of tainted data still returns. Can information produced by torture ever be used without extending the original crime? Does refusing to use it honor the victims, or does it waste the only record of what was done to them? There is no easy answer. But Unit 731 shows what happens when that answer is made in secret by the same powers that benefit from the data. It also shaped regional memory. In China, Unit 731 became part of the wider history of Japanese occupation and wartime brutality. In Japan, acknowledgement developed unevenly, contested by denial, limited official statements, and the slow release of records. In the United States, the story challenged the cleaner image of post-war justice. The Allied victory had defeated fascist empires, but victory did not prevent compromise with atrocity when new strategic fears appeared. The most disturbing part of the Unit 731 cover-up is not only that criminals escaped, it is that the language of science and security made the escape appear practical. Men who had destroyed the meaning of medical duty were treated as sources. Human beings who had been reduced to experimental material in life were reduced again after death into intelligence. The scandal was not only that the United States received the files, it was that the victims were never allowed to stand at the center of the decision. In the ruins of Pingfang, the destroyed buildings were meant to erase evidence. The greater erasure happened afterward, in offices, cables, and classified files. A war crimes case became a research opportunity. A public trial became a secret exchange. The dead were denied the one thing a court might still have given them: recognition that what happened to them mattered more than the data taken from their bodies. That was the bargain. Not science against ignorance, not security against danger. It was justice traded for possession of a secret. And the stain of that choice did not remain buried in Manchuria. It followed the post-war order into its courts, its laboratories, and its claims of moral authority.